Hi, everyone. My name is María del Pilar Blanco, and I'm very, very happy to be hosting this fourth seminar of the Caribbean Studies Network, which is hosted at Torch. I'm very, very happy to be introducing our speaker today, Sara Molinari, who is coming to us from the States. Sara is a current PhD candidate in cultural anthropology and is also an American Studies dissertation fellow at the Graduate Center at CUNY at the City University of New York. Sara's research deals with questions of how ordinary people confront the crises of debt and also climate catastrophe in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. Sara was a visiting researcher at the University of Puerto Rico Institute of Caribbean Studies, and that was from February 2018 to June 2019. And that's when I got to meet Sara when she first came to Oxford, so we're so happy to have her here again. Sara is a co-founder of the Puerto Rico Syllabus, a feminist collective and also a digital humanities project that archives different resources for teaching and learning about Puerto Rico's crises. She has worked at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies as an events coordinator. She's an oral historian at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies in Hunter College, and has also been a lecturer at Hunter College, where she's taught courses in the Caribbean and ethnography. Some recent publications by Sara include an essay entitled The Public Reckoning, Anti-Debt Futures After Ricky Renuncia. And this was published in the Decolonial Geographies of Puerto Rico's 2019 summer protest. And this was edited by Joaquín Villanueva and Marisol Lebrón for the Society in Space Journal. And another publication to draw your attention to is from 2019, and it's titled Authenticating Loss and Contesting Recovery, Fema and the Politics of Colonial Disaster Management. And this was in the very, very wonderful collection edited by Yarimar Bonilla and Marisol Lebrón called The Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm. And that's, of course, Hurricane Maria. Sara is going to be talking today about resistance and schools and the different spaces that have been becoming very interesting sites of resistance in Puerto Rico at this point after 2019, after Hurricane Maria. And what we're going to be doing is Sara's going to be taking us through her project, and we're going to have some time at the end in the last half of the hour and for you to ask questions. So whenever you have any questions, you will see that there's a chat function at the very bottom of our screen. Please pop in anything and I will read your question out to Sara so she can respond. And now take it away, Sara.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Well, first, thank you, Dr. Blanco, to Torch and the Caribbean Studies Network for the invitation today. Thank you to the discussants and the technology assistants, as well as everyone joining us virtually. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. So today I'm going to share an overview of a work in progress and some ideas I'm currently developing in a dissertation chapter. My project is based on 19 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Puerto Rico between 2018 and 2019, and it examines how Puerto Ricans experience and resist overlapping climate, colonial, and economic crises. My work centers around 2 points of activism: debt resistance coalescing around the demand for a comprehensive citizen debt audit, and intergenerational mutual aid organizing in the wake of Hurricane Maria, which I'll be focusing more on today. So first, I'm going to draw a bit on my ethnographic material to situate the kinds of articulations happening between school occupation and mutual aid. Then I'm going to discuss more about targeted divestment in public education in Puerto Rico, focusing on how school closures demonstrate the failures of education reform, but also open new spaces of possibility for resistance. And lastly, I'll go back to these emerging school occupations to highlight them as critical tactics of debt refusal from which alternative social infrastructures emerge. One morning in August 2018, organizers at the Centro de Apoyo Mutuo, Mutual Aid Center, or CAM, as I'll be referring to it, located in Las Carolinas Caguas, sat around the table in the comedor, or the communal kitchen, with coffee and snacks for the usual social conversations, gossip, and planning that took place while others cleaned or did supply checks and chimed in sporadically. The designated chefs for the day were cooking upwards of 100 meals for delivery to elderly and disabled residents on 2 donated gas and electric stoves. The comedor was connected to improvised water lines built with PVC piping after residents occupied the María Montañez Gomez Elementary School in November 2016. This was, of course, 2 months after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and 6 months after the Department of Education shut down this school, supposedly due to decreasing enrollment. That day at the CAM, the organizers were discussing the possibility of opening up another classroom as an activity center geared towards elderly residents of the neighborhood, especially considering that over half the population of about 2,500 residents is over 55 years old. The activity center, which came to be called the Centro Nuevo Amanecer, or the Center for a New Beginning, would diversify access to the occupied school space and attract new participants. Each part of the occupied school that could be opened produced a placemaking effect. With a new use value, the transformed classrooms expanded both the CAM's community reach and the participants' sense of spatial ownership, autonomy, and rescue. The plans included preparing a room for arts and crafts located in a classroom where elders would have easy access on a flat concrete path to the restrooms in the back of the school. Coffee, snacks, and a sit-down lunch in the comedor were to be provided. And arts and crafts were explicitly recognized as therapeutic activity that organizers were enthusiastic to offer participants as a new creative outlet. During the planning discussions, the conversation shifted to a recent El Nuevo Dia article that was published just a few days earlier. It was Puerto Rico's first major periodical that spotlighted this CAM. As the newspaper was passed around, 2 of the women expressed their dissatisfaction with the media portrayal of their mutual aid efforts, especially the article's narrow focus on responding to community hunger and the militaristic imagery conveyed in the title. And the title was, "The Hunger SWAT Team Feeds Hope in Caguas." The article highlights 2 sisters in their 60s who live in the neighborhood. One is a caretaker for the other in a wheelchair. The CAM provides what the article calls the sisters' main source of sustenance with 3 prepared hot meals per week. So here, individual suffering is portrayed as an exceptional condition ameliorated by heroic volunteer labor, or the SWAT team. Absent from this portrayal, however, is a sense of the CAM's organization of care and life-affirming practices through and beyond the disaster emergency and their political use of occupation tactics. During the discussion about how to respond to the article, one of the leaders said, "What we have here is not hunger, but rather loneliness. People have food," end quote. Asserting that people have food thus shifts the focus of mutual aid and recovery work to other social relations of care beyond survival. Instead, food serves as a relational bridge to broker care, accompaniment, and affective relations. And these images here is the logo of this CAM, an image of the comedor and women preparing the food, as well as the bazaar or the thrift shop. Emulating post-Hurricane Maria initiation of about a dozen mutual aid centers across the archipelago of Puerto Rico, Las Carolinas residents entered and occupied their closed neighborhood elementary school without official authorization. In the context of infrastructural collapse and government neglect, Their initial objective was to cook and serve hot meals to ensure residents met basic needs. The physical space of the abandoned school comedor in effect became a hub to organize alternative social infrastructures through the collectivization of domestic appliances, hot meals that far surpassed official emergency provisions, potable water, electrical outlets, supplies, carpooling, and information networks. However, organizers' vision extended beyond the emergency disaster period marked by the neighborhood's electricity and water restoration in March 2018. Infrastructures of care were organically expanded to include lunch delivery routes to elderly and disabled residents and their caregivers. Organizers also administered multiple survey tools to assess residents' ongoing needs and interests, and transformed the classroom spaces into a wellness and healing clinic for acupuncture, massage, and aromatherapy, a bazaar or a thrift shop to generate money to run the CAM, and the activity center for the elders that I mentioned earlier. The CAM Las Carolinas and other grassroots project of autogestión, or autonomous organizing, demonstrate how mutual aid practices may not just be short-term survival solutions or charitable acts, but rather they can be mobilized over time to develop social, affective, and ecological infrastructures of care that support well-being and refuse the organizing values, discourses, and practices of neoliberal disaster recovery and austerity politics. So I use this vignette as a point of departure to pull together threads around debt, infrastructure, and resistance that I'll be discussing. I hope to make a dual argument. First, school closures visibilize the colonial politics of disposability and debt capture as a social spatial process. At the same time, the proliferation of abandoned school structures in times of crisis has catalyzed new tactics of resistance, refusal, and autogestión at the margins of or through strategic entanglements with the state. Secondly, I argue that school rescues and occupations, like what's taking place at the CAM Las Carolinas, have become key sites for insurgent geographies of mutual aid, emerging across the archipelago. In thinking about these rescues, I'm working through a conceptualization of infrastructures of care to show how mutual aid collectives envision disaster recovery otherwise, and expand their work beyond a short temporality of survival. And just a note that when I refer to infrastructure during the talk, I'm drawing on relational and lived theories of infrastructure that mesh both the physical or material stuff with social, symbolic, and affective dimensions. I'll also be using the terms occupation and rescue interchangeably to acknowledge both the vocabulary preferences of my interlocutors and the spirit of rehabilitative rescue coupled with the politically confrontational nature of occupation. And this is a map from 2019 of the different centros de apoyo mutuo across Puerto Rico. The blue circle, there's a blue circle around the CAM Las Carolinas and Caguas. Public education has been a primary target of organized abandonment and austerity cutbacks in Puerto Rico, in effect, one of the many casualties of debt governance. Since 2016, the unincorporated US territory has been in a process of debt restructuring and fiscal reorganization, guided by an unelected, federally appointed oversight board, which many argue is the latest manifestation of the colonial arrangement. Public education is a strategic target for both the oversight board and the local government in pushing towards charter schools and suppressing political opposition via the slow dismantling of the University of Puerto Rico, which has long served as a site of social and political struggle. And of course, in the wake of climate disaster, it's important to look at similar conjunctures across US jurisdictions. For example, Hurricane Katrina marked a watershed moment in the transformation of public education in New Orleans and the implementation of the charter school model. And this here is a juxtaposition of what some of the abandoned school structures look like on the left, and on the right, a transformed school structure at the CAM Las Carolinas. In early February 2021, the Puerto Rican Senate passed a resolution to investigate the use and condition of all public schools closed between 2011 and 2021. Over this decade, hundreds of public schools were shut down. The process accelerated in 2013, and during the last austerity wave between 2017 and 2019, a staggering 34% of public schools, totaling 438 schools, were closed under the leadership of Secretary of Education Julia Kelleher, who is now under federal investigation, and the governorship of Ricardo Rosselló, who of course was forced to resign after the Verano Boricua, or the 2019 summer mass mobilizations. Reports frequently highlight the afterlives of abandoned school buildings that have become breeding grounds for pests, clandestine storage units, garbage dumps, and even horse stables. Scholars such as Rima Brusi have pointed to the shifting narratives and design around education reform in Puerto Rico, from the language of school consolidation in the late 2010s to the school choice narrative of the 2017 Education Reform Bill that formalized public to private transfers through vouchers and charter schools. And many saw this education reform bill within the politics of disaster capitalism because it was pushed through the legislature in the immediate months following Hurricane Maria, when most Puerto Ricans were out of water and electricity. And of course, it was much more difficult to organize politically. While the government and the oversight board's justification for shutting down schools and displacing students has been to generate extensive savings for the bankrupt territory, the opposite has proven true. Economist Jose Caraballo Cueto recently published an analysis in which he found the savings between 2017 to 2020 to be only about 2%, while the Department of Education's school maintenance cost drastically increased over the same time period. 65% of school closures between 2006 and 2018 have occurred in rural areas, which are disproportionately impacted by poverty and dismal public transportation. So the distribution of these closures maps onto and exacerbates already existing spatial, economic, and racial inequalities. Furthermore, school closure decisions have not contemplated long-term risk mitigation. The 2019 to 2020 earthquake swarm in Puerto Rico permanently damaged over half of the functioning public schools in southwestern municipalities, while some schools that had been closed did not sustain any structural damage. Public school buildings can also serve as emergency shelters, so vulnerable communities are thus deprived of these shelters as a result of the closures, in of course the time where they might need it the most. Ex-Governor Ricardo Rosselló initiated a process through executive order in 2017 for organizations and municipalities to submit applications to purchase or lease school facilities in disuse, claiming that priority would be given for community use proposals. As of 2020, though, only 18% of the schools closed since 2007 have been formally contracted for reuse. The average sale price of a school property is $400,000, and lease contracts, which characterize 80% of all the reuse arrangements, tend to favor private or for-profit schools, educational nonprofits, and private real estate or commercial developers, as a report by the Centro para la Reconstrucción del Hábitat has documented. Contrary to official claims to prioritize impacted communities, the sale and lease applications are in fact exclusionary for spontaneously organized collectives who are not visible to the state, without official status designations and significant financial resources. Schools, of course, are also sites of intersecting social fabrics and social infrastructures, and so their closures have ripple effects in communities. Take, for example, the case of the María Montañez Gómez School that I mentioned earlier, which is situated in the semi-rural working-class barrio of Las Carolinas Caguas, which has now become the Centro de Apoyo Mutuo. Prior to the 2017 closing and subsequent rescue by neighborhood residents, the school had long been a politicized site. Parents had organized protest, pickets, press conferences, and strikes blockading the school's entrance since rumors began circulating about its closure around 2010. In interviews, mothers and teachers recalled how institutional explanations for closure shifted from students performing below average on standardized tests to low enrollment. Both arguments the school community contested. The 2017 school closure had a very gendered local impact. For example, Karina, one of the CAM leaders and mother of 3, often relayed to me the difficulties she experienced transferring her son from the María Montañez Gómez school to another public school in downtown Caguas. And spatially, downtown Caguas is not that far. It's about a 15-minute drive, but it's complicated for a number of reasons. So Karina does not have a driver's license and her husband works full-time and uses the car. Her youngest son's transfer required him to wake up before 6 a.m. to be at the one school bus stop in front of the corner store that was a 10-minute walk from their home. Public school bus transportation in Puerto Rico is means tested, so Karina must apply to access it every year. In the case of an emergency or the all too common school interruptions due to electrical blackouts, Karina must coordinate a trip with the few times a public van service passes through Las Carolinas and endures an over 1 hour long trip to get to her son's school. Beyond mobility constraints, residents note deterioration of the neighborhood ball field and recreational spaces adjacent to the school, shown in these photos. There's the basketball court and in the back, the baseball field. And these spaces used to serve as central, spaces of community gathering, but now residents either organize themselves to maintain the spaces as best as possible, or the Residents Association petitions the municipality for occasional service. Elderly residents speak of local baseball games as part of a distant past, and it took over a year for an agreement to be reached about which entity was responsible for repairing the mesh covering of the basketball court, which became unusable after Hurricane Maria ripped off the protection from bird excrement. And very strikingly, the conditions in which the Department of Education leaves closed schools illuminates a politics of haste and disposability that has guided this closure process and the afterlives of these abandoned buildings. Here are images of the discard left in classrooms of the María Montañez Gómez School that I took as the school rescuers began to clean out individual classrooms in order to repurpose them. We can see here over 24 laptops, a TV that I think is actually cut out of the middle photo, but it's there to the side, textbooks and encyclopedias, as well as manila envelopes that contain sensitive and identifiable documents, including students' school records, contact information, and personalized certificates. And indeed, it was a very traumatic experience for women to discover what was behind shuttered classroom doors in the beloved school where up to 3 generations of residents had graduated from. Now I'm going to close by talking a bit more about school occupations within broader geographies of mutual aid, specifically focusing on rescues in the conjuncture of climate disaster and accelerated school shutdown and their complicated relationships with the state. Contemporary school rescues draw on long histories of protest occupations in Puerto Rico, where bodies and demands crystallize in politically significant spaces. For example, we can think back to the Rescate movement of the late 1960s to 1980s, which was characterized by informal land occupations and self-built housing. The waves of civil disobedience and protest encampments on restricted land during the struggle to remove the US Navy from Vieques, and to the more recent encampment against coal ash in Peñuelas to stop toxic dumping in local landfills, as well as the very recent emergence of the alacenas feministas, or the feminist pantries, some of which have literally been built into the walls of closed school buildings to facilitate solidarity exchange during the pandemic, and countless other examples. Referring to the post-María mutual aid centers and affiliated projects spatialized across various structural vestiges of the state, Puerto Rican organizer Giovanni Roberto asserts that these projects configure what he calls, quote, radical autogestión movements, end quote, that rely on the politicization of daily life over more traditional tactics of street protest. And from these occupied vestiges of the state, he argues, new forms of political power can emerge. An exciting example of this emergent political power is La Conde project in the municipality of Carolina, where the Department of Education shut down the Carlos Conde Marin School in May 2017. The women's group called Parceleras Afro-Caribeñas para Transformación Barrial, or PATPA, includes alumni and mothers of affected school children, and they have transformed their school as a base for their anti-racist and ecological work. And this is an advertisement for one of their brigades to clean up the green spaces and remove debris. So they were inviting people to join their brigade. The group has made significant physical improvements to the school structure, prompted a narrative of possession without permission, and developed recreational eco-trails, solar cinemas, and a community kitchen. After 3 years waiting for a government response, PATPA's school rental application was finally approved in November 2020. Like La Conde project, the CAM Las Carolinas has experienced the state's persistent disregard in their now 3-year wait on their school lease application. In this liminal space between unauthorized occupation and formal lease, rescuers construct ownership claims to the school property in moral, spatial, and labor terms, including active self-maintenance, aesthetic appropriation, and ecological stewardship, centered around cultivating some of the food that they produce and cook for the residents. Moral claims to the school as a kind of returned commons for the community are called upon as a political vocabulary, and this was repeated in my interviews, in their promotional materials and social media, as well as in public defenses of the CAM. For example, in October 2019, organizers and participants held a protest in front of the Capitolio, or the Capitol building in San Juan, to pressure legislators in passing a resolution to ease school leasing processes for community groups, as the photos here show. And some of these signs say, we want to be heard now, please, 2 years, waiting for the title to the school, when is it coming? And indeed, it was a striking demonstration of elderly protagonists confronting the state, entering legislators' offices, refusing the guards' orders to take down their tent, and demanding the right to their school. Over 1 year later, the lease has still not been confirmed, but the rescue and intergenerational circuits of care persist. I want to suggest that these cases intersecting occupation, mutual aid, and autogestión activate multiple sites of refusal. By reclaiming and repurposing spaces of abandonment, occupiers refuse the logic of debt capture that renders disposable both people and the social infrastructures crystallized in public schools. Secondly, the infrastructures of care that emerge from these rescues extend the temporalities of disaster beyond an emergency moment, locating repair outside of the realm of privatized resiliency, the free market, or the domestic sphere. Perhaps we can see them through the lens of what Deborah Cohen calls fugitive infrastructures, the future-oriented alternative systems, relations, and assemblages that allow for sustenance and life-making under conditions of inequality and duress. So thank you. That's the end of my talk, and I just wanted to ask if it was okay to share a list, a Google Doc link with a list of resources that I referred to throughout the chat, throughout the talk, that I hope folks can refer back to in the future. If that could be shared in the chat, that's great. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. And it gives us, I love the way that you're weaving in so many different registers, because we're talking about these kind of effective communities, and you're linking them to real social structures that are developing, that are emergent, that are fugitive and future oriented. I think this is great. I wanted to just remind our listeners that we have the Q&A button, I don't know what you call it, the window at the bottom. Please put in your questions. I see that there's already one from Emily Gregg. So I'm going to let Emily have the first question because she put it in there quick, very, very early. And then I had some comments that I wanted to also provide, but I think it's a very good way to begin. This question from Emily. She says, "Thank you, Sarah, for a really fascinating talk. I was wondering what the students' reaction was to shutting down the schools. Have there been any student protests against the cuts? And what has been their involvement, if any, in the mutual aid movement?"
Sure. So thank you, Emily, for the question. I think a really interesting part about these protests of the school closures that I've seen has been their intergenerational nature. So they often bring together the students that are impacted by the closure, as well as the parents, right? Parents are very active political participants, and the teachers often participate in things like strikes as well. So a strike that was held at the María Montañez Gómez School a few years before its closing, for example, brought all of these constituencies together. And it, teachers shared with me, it was quite difficult to be part of the strike, right? To hold that line and not enter the school, right? And actually the fire department had to come at that point and open a gate in the back of the school so that the classes could resume. So yeah, the protests have multiple participants, and in terms of the mutual aid, that's the same thing. And I'm very interested again in this intergenerational aspect. So for example, at the CAM Las Carolinas, students who were impacted by the closure were one of the first, the first people to open, quote unquote, open the school, like break the locks and enter, and that kind of act of initial occupation, right? They were involved in, and young people are also very involved in the kind of solidarity economy work that's organized around a lot of these CAMs. So in the CAM Las Carolinas, for example, there are barber shops, there's a doula service, right? And these are different ways to integrate especially younger folks. And there's also a process of training younger folks in acupuncture, especially. That's a very kind of important political form of alternative healing. So a lot of young people from the community are involved in that. So yes, thank you for this question. This intergenerational aspect is very important.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you, Emily, for your question. Again, keep them coming. I had a question, it's about intergenerational, but I was very interested in you kind of linking what is happening to schools with also the other big dismantling that is happening, which is the University of Puerto Rico system, which of course has different campuses all around the island. And I was wondering, I mean, these processes involve a lot of education, right? How do you, I wanted to know what involvement educators from the university system have in inculcating certain modes of organizing and activism. Because I'm gathering that a lot of these women a lot of these mothers they work, or they may be working at home. They're staying at home moms. So how does a university community, and a university community like the UPR, where resistance has been so prevalent and so important as part of its constitution, how do they get involved in these movements?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Mari. Very interestingly, there's a trajectory from activism in the University of Puerto Rico student movement to these geographies of mutual aid that are emerging out, especially since Hurricane Maria. So the first Centro de Apoyo Mutuo, the first mutual aid center that emerged in downtown Caguas, was in fact led by organizers that had been very involved with recent strikes at the University of Puerto Rico, and had been promoting, a lot of different kinds of anti-austerity politics around student food insecurity on campuses, building comedores sociales on different University of Puerto Rico campuses, and then their work transferred to this more direct occupation of public spaces to provide mutual aid, right, in the wake of Hurricane Maria. So this trajectory is very prevalent, including in the more rural centros de apoyo mutuo, where a lot of former students and former student activists are involved in agroecology, different kinds of design for solar installations and things like that in the more rural areas. So there is this trajectory. In the CAM Las Carolinas, it's a bit distinct in the sense that the leaders are the leaders are the community members themselves, the women and elderly people. There's coalitions, and there's participation certainly from activists with these more university-oriented trajectories, but really the women are the women are the protagonists, and they do not come from the University of Puerto Rico. Many of them had up to high school, educational attainment, some associate's degrees. So it's a bit distinct in that way, that there's a lot of co-participation, but the leaders in this case are the women from the neighborhood themselves. And I think that's what makes it also a very important case. But certainly across the kind of geographies of mutual aid, it's very clear the trajectories between student activism at the University of Puerto Rico and new modes of autogestión.
And of course, being women, I'm wondering, are the fathers, a visible presence in the protests and in the occupations of the schools, or really do you see it's a predominantly female group?
It's predominantly women leading this, and I think that speaks a lot to the the gendered impacts of the debt, how the debt crisis has settled down in people's daily lives in very gendered ways. And so I actually didn't get to interview fathers in particular. I was focusing more on mothers that had been involved in these protests against the school closure, teachers that had been teachers at the school, right? But I definitely had the sense that it was really led by women. I mean, women were the ones that were bringing their children to school on a daily basis. They were involved in the kind of negotiations. They had relationships with the teachers. So I think that that gendered impact also shaped how women took control of the space in another way, right? They occupied the school, and they're rescuing the school.
And that's I was very taken with the story of the mother who is struggling to move her child to a different school because the local school had been shut. And I was wondering if you have any data on children that were just literally left behind, that basically the commute was one complication too many for families that are already overstretched, that, you know, there's a transport system that is basically non-existent. You'd rely on cars. And if it's a one car household, how do you get to that? I mean, are we seeing a kind of mass of Puerto Rican children who are not attending school because of these closures?
Well, a lot of families choose to leave communities, whether it's to move to another municipality or neighborhood where access to another public school is easier, or migrating to the continental U.S., right, which we've seen really the jump in migrations throughout the economic crisis. So, but maybe the more subtle ways that this takes place that I have, anecdotal information from, with my interlocutors, is that it really makes the basic things like half days of school, school events or plays, extracurricular activities, it makes those kinds of things much more difficult. So often mothers might decide to keep their child home from school if it's just a half day of school for whatever reason, if they're getting let out at 12 o'clock. It's almost not worth it to go through the kind of the stress of public transportation, because of how dismal it is, right, to coordinate a pickup, and all this. So I think it impacts in those like very, very specific ways. Oftentimes, if there were, blackouts in the schools, that was another big problem for mothers to pick up their children, as I had mentioned, or if there was, expected or planned blackouts, or especially in the wake of Hurricane Maria, that mothers would often just keep their children home from school because it was just too much of a hassle to get them there. So I think it impacts in those different kind of subtle ways.
Thanks. We have a question for you, Sarah, from an anonymous attendee. Thank you so much for the talk. It was quite illuminating. You spoke a bit about how other social protests and movements have propped up around some of the other camps. And I was wondering how and if they have been in conversation with one another or largely individual. I think you touched upon this a little bit with the UPR, but it would be good to talk about other social movements.
Sure. So the CAMs had organized, in fact, into a network, an island-wide an archipelago-wide network called the Red de Apoyo Mutuo. And that map that I showed earlier in the slides pointing to the different CAMs, right, that was from the redapoyomutuo.com, the website that had been developed. So there is this sense of building a network coalition among the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo. Mm-hmm. There's also a kind of new development that I'm involved in a more advisory capacity called the Red Regional de Apoyo Mutuo, the regional mutual aid network. And this network is more centered on the CAMs in the semi-rural or rural areas of Puerto Rico, to find ways of exchange, to develop brigades, to be in conversation with each other, and to really try to politicize, especially how rural or mountainous areas of Puerto Rico are impacted in this conjuncture of climate and economic crisis. So yes, there is coalitions forming. There's a lot of communication among the CAMs. Out of the about 12 or 13 initial CAMs that emerged after Hurricane Maria, I believe about 6 or 7 are still fully functioning. So that's quite impressive. And that speaks, I think, to my larger point here that, right, I don't want to see these CAMs as just responding to an immediate emergency moment and as a strategy of survival, right? That's, of course, how a lot of them initially developed, and it was literally about feeding people. But as we see over time, what's emerged is much deeper than that. It's beyond the emergency. So those are kinds of what I'm trying to point to here. And it's very exciting. The Red Regional de Apoyo Mutuo now, for example, is organizing a brigade in Lares in March. We have meetings where at least like 4 different CAM representatives are present. There's talk of doing Zoom exchanges with agroecologists in Honduras. So there's a lot of this networking going on, and definitely communication between the CAMs.
And I mean, Zoom has reminded us that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I was wondering how the virus and COVID has affected any of this organizing recently in Puerto Rico. I know that it goes beyond your period of field work, but I was really interested in hearing if activities have been affected at all.
Yes, absolutely. One project that's been really central during the pandemic in a number of CAMs, including the CAM Las Carolinas, is the compras solidarias, the kind of solidarity purchases. So CAMs organized food shopping, for example, and delivery runs of groceries for residents, rather than having people come to the comedor or use the space in ways that they might when it's not a pandemic, right? There was a kind of a big effort to increase their delivery services of grocery shopping, for example. So that was a big thing that the CAM Las Carolinas participated in. They're using all the security measures possible. They have a much more cut back schedule at this point, specifically the CAM Las Carolinas. But they're trying to reopen little by little, using all the precautionary measures, of course, considering that the people they serve are especially vulnerable because it's an elderly population. So yeah, but I don't think it's impacted them in the way that they're less attached to the space, right? They have not let go of any of their claims to the rescue or occupation, and I think they're just trying to negotiate the ways to do it safely until we can move forward a bit.
Thanks. We have 3 questions that popped up just at the same time, so simultaneously. One is from Calvin. Great talk with lots of things to think through, Sarah. Does shifting federal administrations give any sense of how debt relief, school closures, and et cetera might change, or will status quo continue?
Thank you, Calvin, for the question. I think that, the debt relief is a very interesting question, as we're now upon a new a revised debt restructuring bill, which doesn't bode well for working people in Puerto Rico, for pensioners, for example, all kinds of groups. It does bode very well for debt collectors and hedge funds. The school closures supposedly have come to a halt for now, temporarily. I don't know how long that's going to actually be true, but of course there was, in the previous administration, so much outrage with the closing of 438 schools under Julia Kelleher, right, who is under federal fraud investigations. So, right, that she really kind of symbolized much public discontent over austerity and over the post-Maria recovery process, and also, right, the ousting of Ricardo Rosselló. I think people were rightly so extremely upset about what this administration was doing. So I don't know how promising that kind of pause to the closures is, and of course all of the localized impacts are still there of the existing closures. I believe yesterday schools got the green light to start reopening in-person classes in Puerto Rico. They had been online, which is a whole another layer of inaccessibility due to, poor internet connection. Folks don't have the resources they need to do schooling online. But reopening schools, in the case of Southern Puerto Rico, for example, is very complicated because, like I had mentioned, so many of the school structures were damaged from the earthquake swarm. So there's talk of trying to use the period between now and August to repair those buildings, right? But a lot of, I think, questions remain open. There is some hope of a legislative directed debt audit, for example, now with new, more progressive legislators at the local government in Puerto Rico. But I don't see much in terms of significant debt relief and debt cancellation, which is what Puerto Rico really needs, to even with the shift in administration and with President Biden.
That's incredibly sobering, but also not surprising. I see that Colleen has a question, which in a way you've answered. Is there a movement to open the schools again or to improve transportation for the families you refer to who have limited access?
I don't know of any centralized efforts to improve public transportation at these local levels. And I think it's important to understand the terms of organized abandonment or austerity, right? To be this this kind of all-encompassing process, right? So it's not casual, for example, that schools are being closed in the rural areas where there's less access to public transportation. It's more difficult for people to get to the schools that students are displaced to, right? So people, I think, really are making these connections, and it impacts everything from their political activity, the politicization of these spaces, to their decisions, which might be, for example, to move to another community or to move to the continental US, because it's just not bearable. Right. So the public transportation, of course, has been cut with austerity. So my interlocutors relayed to me how the municipal van service, it's a small van, not a big bus service. Right. They used to have many more routes, right, over the last 10, 20 years, but it's recently been cut back, and there's only two or three times that this van passes. So what I was trying to get at with the kind of, it's a short distance, right, to downtown Caguas. It's only in a car. If you have a car, it's a 15-minute drive. But when you don't have a car, and when you're relying on a van that stops 3 times at one place, you have to get to that stop and you have to kind of move along. But especially women have all kinds of strategies, like giving the van driver a few extra dollars to take her to a specific location in downtown Caguas, because the downtown is very much where all the services are, right? The doctor's appointments, a lot of the schools students have been displaced to, the food shopping, et cetera. So it's a very cumbersome process.
We have a question from Sam, who thanks you for your talk. He says, I was wondering if you have seen any relationship between the dismantling of educational infrastructure and medical infrastructure, or access to community health resources, especially with COVID-19. Is there any involvement of the GAMS with healthcare provision? Good question.
Yes. So again, kind of seeing the intersection of these, the dismantling of these infrastructures in terms of organized abandonment. Yes, the CAMS have been very involved in alternative forms of healthcare provision, as well as organizing things like medical brigades through doctors' networks, relationships with psychologists, right? And these were very prominent in the wake of Hurricane Maria, and especially when I was doing my field work. contacts from the University of Puerto Rico's medical school would frequent the CAMs and organize these kinds of big medical brigades or clinics where they would, in Las Carolinas' case, right, go actually door to door to talk to people, to provide kind of basic healthcare, to try to connect folks to municipal services, and the alternative, I think, healthcare provisions are very important here too. So I mentioned a bit about the acupuncture spaces, and those kinds of modes of healing have been very prominent throughout all of these centros de apoyo mutuo in Puerto Rico, kind of simultaneously critiquing the Western biomedical system through a practice that's technically only authorized to be done by medical doctors in Puerto Rico, right? That only doctors are supposed to be practicing acupuncture. So a lot of younger folks are trained in a specific method of acupuncture and have developed these healing spaces at the CAMs as also a way to work through trauma, right? To attend to the different effects of trauma, whether it's insomnia, stress, anxiety, things like that. So there's this kind of dual practice of trying to network with independent medical brigades to bring them directly to communities, while also practicing these alternative healing clinics.
Right. So we have just a few minutes left. If anyone has a last minute brief question to ask Sarah, this is your moment to type like a fury. I just wanted to ask you, Sarah, because you obviously, this is one part of your research, and of course you have been looking at other kinds of protests against the debt in Puerto Rico. And how do you see all of these different groups that you have been in contact with? How do you see them working together? Have they created a very efficient web of activism in Puerto Rico, or do you feel that there's still more kind of cohesion to be developed amongst them?
Well, specifically, I'll speak to the kind of two modes of activism that I'm most familiar with in my work, which is this movement, this coalitional movement to audit the debt, and these mutual aid centers that emerged after Hurricane Maria. I actually see both of them in terms of debt refusal, but in different ways. And there's not, for example, in the two groups I work with, a lot of overlap because of differences in class background, in spatial location. The movement, for example, to audit the debt tends to be more urban centric, activist with different kinds of professional experience, with more access to the legislator, for example, to different forms of expert knowledge, to produce these kinds of counter narratives about the debt. Whereas the mutual aid work is really emerging from a grassroots space for a lot of people that do not have these kinds of professional backgrounds. So there's not necessarily an overlap, but I see both of them in different kinds of modes of debt refusal. One being about this concrete politicization of daily life, a revaluation of social reproductive labor that uses occupation tactics like the ones I've been speaking about, right? And the other relying on more traditional modes of street protest and strategic use of expert knowledge and things like that. So there are kind of overlaps in their projects to an extent, but not necessarily in terms of participants. But I think they both speak to the really this current conjuncture.
So thank you so much. I think we have to stop this here now. You have been so clear, and there are so many interesting ways that you are connecting affect and politics. And I am so happy that you were able to come speak to us. Thank you to everyone who has attended today's seminar. Thank you so much for your questions. There will be one more event this term for the Caribbean Studies Network, and that is a conversation on 16th of March, 2021 at 5 p.m. And that's to celebrate the publication of Will Ghosh's book, which is Via's Naipaul, Caribbean Writing, Caribbean Thought. So do please go to the Torch website to register for that event if you can join us. And I just wanted to thank Sarah Molinari again so much for being here with us so early for you, all the way in the States. Thank you. And if you want to watch this again, you will have access to the webinar online, which is one of the virtues of this COVID world. So thank you so much. And Sarah, stay on for a little while, but we'll see our audience out.
Thank you, everyone.